And I want to welcome you to your first engineer rally point. When we did town halls, you asked for a professional development aimed at young leaders, given by young leaders on topics that are of interest to young leaders. And at a time in the evening in which you didn't have to take off from work and you could do this right in your home, listen to a quick discussion about a hot topic. And then of course, we'll record this and we'll hang it on our website. So this is for you. And we're going to have an incredible discussion tonight, not the normal river crossing discussion, because we're really going to have feature young leaders that will tell you their role and we'll build the context. But this is really about lessons learned down at the company level. So with that, Anthony, Rugged Six, over to you, sir.
Hey, sir, thank you very much. We'll go to the next slide. So, sir, I'm just going to be setting this up as a scene setter because as General Watson just said, everybody, like this couldn't be a more relevant topic at a more relevant time. And you're going to hear throughout our guest speakers tonight why that's the case. So my name is Colonel Anthony Barbina. I'm the commander of 36th Engineer Brigade. My job today is really to set the context and give you a little bit of a scene setter because our focus is going to be on the very tactical view, wet gap crossing area, and some of the results of things that happened to us this year in Defender Europe 2022. So just as a quick reminder, doctrines out there, but there's a lot of great things you can read online, monographs from CGSC, strategic research proposals from the senior service colleges. There's always a lot of good papers out there people spent months working on. In addition, if you really want to watch another video to supplement this one, the 2019 AUSA Warrior Corners discussion, where General Semonite did the art and science of river crossing. So those are some things to look up. But I want to give you some context. You can see on my slide here is history. The history of wet gap crossing is critical to understand where Chris and Carly and all the folks who are going to talk to you are at today. We've been doing wet gap crossing for thousands of years. It's old, almost as old as warfare. The first major river crossing was 500 BC. King Darius, his chief engineer, Mandracles the Samian, crossed 700,000 people across the Bosphorus to begin the invasion of Europe. 55 BC, Julius Caesar executed a river crossing of 40,000 people over the Rhine by building bridges over a 10-day period. And that was about projecting power and showing that the Roman Empire could go anywhere at any time it pleases. More significantly, here in our own American experience, George Washington, his Christmas crossing has been memorialized in papers and pictures across the country, the Delaware River on December 25th, 1776. During our Civil War, the Union Army's crossing the Rappahannock River has gone down as a part of the Fredericksburg campaign, showing some of the really negative sides of river crossing, the casualties that could result, and the operational delays that can be caused by river crossing itself. General Burnside was actually fired because of this failure. When you go into World War II, General Patton, we all talk about General Patton's Rhine River crossing. It's a famous example, the 6-mile deep bridgehead penetration that surrounded and captured 19,000 demoralized Germans. Patton he rafted, he installed bridges, and he famously captured.
Welcome to Zoom. Enter your meeting ID, followed by pound.
Okay. So the other one example, we have the failed Rapido River crossing in World War II. The Fifth Army, they're crossing the Rapido River. They made it across. They were in southwestern Italy, made it across. The Germans had a huge counterattack and repelled us backwards across the river. We had huge losses, and it is an example of river crossing not securing the far side. So there's all kinds of great examples. I just gave you 6 of them. But the 4 lessons you're going to learn from history that tee up our discussion tonight is, number 1, rivers make great obstacles and they're tremendous in the defense, and they help you build engagement areas. Kind of common sense there, listen to the things I just said. Second is wet gap crossing. If you're going to keep the offensive and maintain op tempo and there's rivers in the area you're working in, you got to be able to do it. Otherwise, tremendous casualties will result. Number 3, wet gap crossings require a ton of engineers. Unless you can keep and seize bridges, you're going to have a lot of engineers, a lot of redundancy, and you have to dedicate a lot of time to these wet gap crossing operations. And then number 4, sustainment warfighting function. As you look back at all these historical crossings, every single one took tons of money, tons of transport, supplies, and a variety of other logistics and sustainment concerns that we have to take into our modern day operations. If we can go to the next build, Jan. So another thing that we're not going to talk a ton about today, but every single leader on the Army Engineer Association needs to know is Gap 8 is like the thing that everyone talks about when they're describing where we're at. That's a result of the Combined Arms Center doing General Lundy's study a few years ago, and they laid out that if we don't want to do MDO, multi-domain operations, against a near peer or a peer threat, a peer adversary, that we're going to have problems. I would kind of, on the unclassified side, there's a lot of great documents out there, but basically it says this: the total Army can execute only 2 times division level deliberate wet gap crossings with all of our assets. Overall, we lack engineer C2 at the brigade level, echelon above brigade engineer battalion C2, and MRBCs. For instance, if a division wants to do an MRBC wet crossing, they need 4 MRBCs for 2 lanes, and they need 1 to do ferrying operations. And that's just 1 400-meter gap. And in Europe and other places, there's tons. So with Gap 8, a thing for another day for you to look at, the regiment's working to increase pre-positioning of bridging, APS, which we used during this operation. They are looking at increasing MRBCs. We employed an MRBC during Defender Europe, and we're building more here at Fort Hood and other places. We're increasing Division C2 capability of engineers. 7th Engineer Brigade is being built over the next 2 years. And line of communication bridging capacity, the ability to install it, and the actual bridges themselves are being placed around the Army. We'll go to the next build. The last thing I want to give you for context before I turn it over to the rest of my team is doctrine. So, doctrine, the ATP 3-90.4 is the doctrinal publication, the Combined Arms Manual. Chapter 5 is what we're going to be referencing throughout today. Doug Merrill is the guy who pretty much runs the manual and is doing all the key updates on it. We are the proponents for the manual. So if you have updates or corrections or things, get those notes to us. Even comments from today's, we can integrate those in. There's a lot of old manuals out there. 90-13 is a good example of one. These just have a lot of good ways to do things, examples, and things you can use like movement tables and nice little diagrams you can copy and paste into your doctrine or presentations. When you think about the doctrine side, bigger picture, wet gap crossings are almost always core division operations. We're going to focus on the wet gap crossing area today with an engineer battalion talking to you, an MRBC, and a platoon leader. But what you need to know is the Corps allocates critical enablers. They identify the major control measures. They manage the critical supplies like APS and Lock B, and they provide air and missile defense for the area to prevent any air interdiction. Corps also has the deception plan, which in today's military environment is absolutely critical. The division mostly almost always synchronizes most wet gap crossings. They coordinate and employ the enablers. They establish a lot of the graphical control measures. They fight the deep fight with long range fires, joint fires, EW, cyber, etc. And they employ the engineer brigade headquarters and apportion out the engineer battalion headquarters and the MRBC augmentation assets. They also assign crossing areas to the BCTs. Last but not least, to neck this thing down, the BCTs, they choose their crossing sites and they choose where they want to employ most of the time our MRBC assets. They execute the plan that we've been talking about, and they're going to be the ones that help make sure we get this right. Nesting in with the enablers, if I would say, if engineers are going to be effective based on this historical talking points, you're going to hear over and over again today, is engineers have to be critical parts of the plan. They have to be tied into all the other maneuver assets. So my DCO, Jason Winkleman, is going to go ahead and take it up. Jason, back over to you.
All right, thank you, Colonel Rubino, for that stage setter on Gap 8. Now we're going to transition this talk to an overview of the wet gap crossings at Defender Europe 22. So 2 company elements from the 36th Engineer Brigade and 3rd Armor Corps deployed to Poland in support of this operation. You can see there in the upper left the task organization chart. So we had 5th Engineer Battalion headquarters out of Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and the 74th MRBC out of Fort Hood, Texas, participate in this exercise. 5th Engineer headquarters served as the crossing area engineer, and 74th served as the crossing site commander. Now, these elements were part of a Polish brigade as per the task org chart on that left. Now, moving to the bottom left of the screen there, we have the timeline for this operation. The units deployed in the latter part of April, and they returned back in early June. Now, you can see there the times that when they arrived there and what they did, such as drawing equipment, preparing for missions, and executing said missions. Now, moving to the right side there on the map, you can see where the units arrived there in Poland, drew their APS equipment, and then prepared for their first mission. Now, one key thing, this was the first time an APS was issued to an MRBC in the European theater. So this was a pretty big undertaking. had a lot of oversight and visibility by the GOs there. Now we go to the first wet gap crossing. This happened at the Vistula River from 10 to 13 May with the key river data indicated in the call out box. Now it's interesting, around the same time, Russia was attempting its own wet gap crossing in eastern Ukraine. But as we've seen in the media, they failed pretty badly at this since they lost significant armor maneuver elements, which equate to about 1 battalion tactical group or so. Now, several days later, we did another wet gap crossing from 16 to 20 May at the Naru River. Now, this marked the first joint interoperability of American and Swedish forces employing an improved ribbon bridge. Now, during this crossing, we had both the Swedish president and other VIPs observing this operation. Now, what's pretty significant about this is the day after we did this river crossing, Sweden filed for NATO membership. So there may be a direct linkage there with our bridge crossing and NATO there. So we'll see. So now that we set the context for this mission, let's actually talk to the company and battalion level leaders that did this. Now, the focus of this talk is on the company level and below. And we have 3 speakers for this event, one from the battalion, company, and platoon level. The battalion level presenter is Major Scott Darhauer. He's the 5th Engineer Battalion S3. The company level presenter is Captain Carly Vernon. She's the commander of the 74th MRBC. And the platoon level leader we have is First Lieutenant Chris Garuya. He's the 1st platoon leader in 74th. Now, I would ask the audience, this is an interactive event. Now, when the speakers get done, there will be an opportunity for Q&A. So as you have questions, please just type them into the chat box there. And I'll serve as the moderator and ask the questions to the panel members after they get done speaking. All right, team. Well, let's get going and hearing some of these lessons learned. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Major Scott Darhauer.
Hey, sir. Thanks for the introduction. This is Major Scott Darhauer. I'm actually here with Lieutenant Colonel Bailey, Command Sergeant Major Miles, and Master Sergeant Semsik. They will be available for questions at the end if needed. So first thing I really want to walk you through is this figure here. So if you look on the left-hand side of the figure there, you see the division main. So this is a division operation, as Colonel Barbina mentioned earlier, with a brigade in the north and a brigade in the south corridor. So on the left-hand side there, you have the division main. That would be your crossing area commander, which is typically the deputy commanding general of that force. In the northern corridor there, you have the crossing area commander, which is the brigade. In this instance, it was the 17th Mech Brigade, but they are the crossing area commander for that corridor in the north there. They are responsible for traffic control points and staging areas as highlighted there. So now we'll move on to crossing area engineers. So back to the division there, the crossing area engineer, that would actually typically be someone like Colonel Barbina, an 06 brigade level commander working with the division main over there. In our instance, in the northern corridor there, Colonel Bailey is the crossing area engineer for the north, and that was the situation for Defender 22. So our real responsibilities in this operation is the holding areas and the call forward areas. And then moving on to the crossing site commander, which is Captain Carly Vernon. She will be talking after me. She's there, we're giving her support, and she's in charge of engineer regulating points and the engineer equipment point, or engineer equipment park, as highlighted in blue there. So moving on, so setting conditions. So first bullet there, understanding capability. This is critical, and really what it means is, can you talk capability to maneuver commander? Can you make that maneuver commander understand equipment required, whether you're rafting or bridging and why you might be doing one, why you might have a heavy raft site versus doing a bridge, how much time it's going to take you to build combat power on the far side. And then, you know, this other thing a lot of people don't know is these 20 ICACs, the Zodiacs that the 74th MRBC had to actually put light forces across the river during phase 2. The next bullet there is conditions for the MRBC. So first, if you want to know the conditions required for an MRBC, you read the technical manual, which is that bottom resource there. The next thing you're going to do is you understand what conditions the battalion can actually set. So for us, we actually use the USACE Reachback program through ERDICT, and we were able to get analysis on both trafficability and stream flow predictions, which were extremely valuable in setting up conditions for this operation. The next point is Army divers. So we had an Army diver attachment, and we actually utilized them to swim the river, and their whole purpose was to identify bathymetry, which is just the conditions of the river, the bottom river conditions, and then any obstacles that were present in the river. And doctrinally, they would also be able to install anti-swimmer nets, which is something we don't talk a whole lot about, but it's something we would do in this type of operation. And then the final point there for setting conditions is operational requirements. So do you understand the actual size of the waiting areas required? So those holding areas, called forward areas, do you know what force is coming? It might be different if it's an armor brigade or it's a striker brigade. So you need to know how large those areas need to be. And the next is the conditions, are the conditions set to actually employ the MRVC? So, during phase 2, were the direct and observed indirect fires removed from the site? Because you're never going to put that MRVC anywhere close until those conditions have been set. Which, if you look at these recent failed river crossings, conditions obviously weren't set to actually conduct them. So moving on to deception, my main point here for engineers is Magruder's principle. All right, so this is allowing enemies to hold on to a pre-existing belief that something's going to happen. So if you look in that southern corridor there, you have a feint going on through Axis Lion. Maybe that is the best place to cross, and that's where the enemy thinks you're going to cross. So our job is to convince them that that is actually what's going to happen. So that southern crossing area, you might commit bridges and assets, but it's just to deceive the enemy into committing assets in the south, where we're actually conducting the operation in the north. So how do engineers fit in the mill deck? Well, here's my challenge to you. So I want you to read about it. All right, so if you go to that Army University Press website I've listed there, there's a LISCO series, and one of them is called Weaving the Tangled Web. So if you read chapter 10 in that, there's actually a really good example of a gap crossing operation. It was how Egypt successfully basically invaded Israel. So I challenge you to read that. There's other great series in there. Into the Breach is an engineer one that's in there, but just read those and it'll really help you understand doctrine and previous history and how it affects wet gap crossings. So I appreciate your time. I'm going to hand you over to Captain Carly Vernon.
Good evening. My name is Captain Carly Vernon. I am the current 74th MRVC commander. My first topic I'm going to hit on is managing operations. So as a company, I have the ability to bridge 213 meters of a wet gap, and that's 106 per platoon, as their MTO is exactly the same. I also have a support platoon. And within that section, we have within that platoon, we have an equipment section and a maintenance section. That equipment section has the ability to improve the slip site so that we are able to get in and quickly build our bridge. If the gap is less than 106 meters, then it's typically run platoon internal. So that means that they are going to do all the necessary tasks to include manning their shore team, their build team, boat operators, doing the EEP operations, the EEP operations. They'll also determine when to push the bridge pieces to the water and when to pull out the broken pieces, and then do any on-site corrections and remediations if necessary. Of my first two missions, both require a platoon size element from the American forces, and we use a contingent from the Swedish forces. So I worked directly with the Swedish company commander to coordinate their half of the bridge and then work to get our two sides connected to make that gap closed. During Defender, we encountered several constraints with land allocation and authorization because the Polish government had to procure the land from either military installations or civilian property. Because of the constraints, we remained flexible and ran operations a little unconventionally. We leveraged the other platoon to supplement certain aspects of the operation to ensure that the building platoon was able to keep on schedule and to standard. During the last mission, we had two simultaneous builds. Typically, the maneuver commander designates which is the main lane. In this one, I designated which one because they're both co-located within a quarter mile of each other. I would typically place myself there and really manage the whole company when it comes to FMC and NMC pieces. So for example, if we have some bridge pieces that have had puncture wounds, then I would allocate certain pieces to the other platoon to make sure that that main avenue is open, or I would move them to the other lane to make sure that we have both lanes open and are able to facilitate traffic. My next point is the SOP and reporting. We were able to use internal reporting procedures, which led to a lot of less confusion having to decipher other units' performance measures and X checks. We have a report within our SOP that is pre-designated percentages built, which we were able to send up to 5th Engineer Battalion. They were able to communicate then to the Polish Brigade and the maneuver unit, and it was a very clear, concise process. My next topic is battalion support. Wet Gap Crossing is an extremely complex mission set, which integrates every single warfighting function. There's a fallacy with Wet Gap Crossing that a lot of people believe that it is a breach of linear obstacle. As engineers, we always strive for redundancy. However, in Wet Gap, if I'm the only MRBC, I am my own redundancy. So we have to protect that asset. So I would work with them to ensure that division and brigade has made the proper measures in place when it comes to warfighting functions so that we're able to get to the gap and cross it. For a battalion who's a crossing area engineer as a commander, I would also expect them to make sure that all the warfighting functions are good, because I don't have the ability to protect myself. I only have the ability to provide local security by my MTO. I would count on the battalion to make sure that all the fires are integrated and that they have ensured that a critical friendly zone is established over the crossing site to protect our assets. They would integrate with the brigade and the division to ensure that we are able to get to the crossing site and quickly build our bridge so that we can get combat power to the far side. From the battalion, I would also need help with terrain management. The MRBC is the largest MTO within the engineer regiment and has a significant amount of space that we need to cover and conceal. For example, if we are building at our longest capability, which is 213 meters, I would need all 56 of my common bridge transporters, which are essentially LHS systems. So I would need to be able to conceal them into a wood line or utilize camo nets if we have them available. And that takes a lot of space. So I need help deconflicting that. And then my last point is interoperability. So during Defender, we had the ability to build with the Swedish Army, as we both have the improved ribbon bridge systems. Because it's the exact same bridge, we're able to interconnect our pieces and extend our operational reach. At the first crossing over the Vistula, we were able to gap cross 190 meters. I had 15 of my pieces and 11 of their pieces connected. At the second one over the Naru, we did 85 meters, which I had 4 of my pieces and 5 of their pieces connected to build the full enclosure. Despite being the same exact bridge, there are operational differences. So for example, they have different doctrine when it comes to military load class systems, meaning that the same bridge for us and them could have different capabilities. So our calculations are predetermined solely based on the size of the raft and the speed of the water, where they determine theirs on site based upon the depth of the water also. So 3 factors. Additionally, they must anchor their rafts when they're loading and unloading for their full enclosures, which is not necessary for us. We have a different boat that has significantly more horsepower, which enables us to hold the raft into place while loading and unloading, while they have to anchor to ensure that it doesn't slip when a vehicle is going on or off. And then typically for a full closure, we want to anchor. However, it may not always be necessary based upon the length of the bridge, the speed of the water, what type of vehicle we're crossing, and then how long it must be open. But we typically always want to anchor, where they have to anchor before they send any vehicles across. The Swedish also have different equipment, which enables them to maneuver their bridges differently and effectively. Their boats are not as powerful as ours. However, they have a special bracket that allows them to transition quickly between conventional and longitudinal rafting, which makes them be able to maneuver very quickly and easily through the water. And then my last point is communication. So between our international partners, communication is always a struggle. So during these exercises, their commander stayed co-located with me so that he was able to call to his unit on the far side of the river, and we were able to coordinate the build together. And this was extremely useful, and I would highly suggest always having liaisons built into future operations. So I will be followed by my first platoon leader, Christopher Garayua, and he's going to discuss our operation at the platoon level.
Hey, good evening, team. First Lieutenant Christopher Garayua, First Platoon Leader with 74th MRBC. I'm accompanied with my platoon sergeant, First Class Jeremy Jackson. So today I'm going to hit on what made our platoon successful at the Wet Gap Crossing at Defender Europe 22. So as a platoon leader, the main concern that you have when you enter a wet gap is accomplishing your mission effectively, efficiently, and then last safely. To do this, you need a team that's motivated, a team that's competent. And to get here it takes extensive training. So by putting your team through that training, you're able to work through any difficulties, any challenges that might come up, and allows everyone to learn their job inside and out, and allows them to learn the job of the soldier to the left and right. Now, this is essential for maintaining the speed on the site, given any challenges or obstacles that might come up while you're working. And you couple this with evaluations at every level. So team, squad, platoon, and lastly, company, to make sure that you are all working cohesively to accomplish the mission at hand. Now, when you actually arrive at the site, rehearsals are a big factor in whether or not you'll be successful. So one of the things that we encountered while we were supporting Defender Europe was we had to work with our allied partners. In doing so, we had to include them in our rehearsals as well. So it's important to do rehearsals at your level, and then rehearsals for all the mission parts that would be implemented to ultimately affect the success of your build. So we worked directly with the Swedish, as Captain Vernon had said. We were able to actually integrate them into our rehearsals, into our teams, and ultimately put our two builds together to accomplish the full enclosures of both Wet Gap 1 and Wet Gap 2. So in doing so, we defined the roles, responsibilities, and lastly established timelines that were essential to maintaining that speed that's on the site. So as an MRBC, you're always concerned with maintaining that speed. Doesn't matter if you run into an obstacle or challenge, you have to continue to build because you have a column of vehicles that are waiting for that successful build to cross over that gap. So another thing that we had that worked in our favor was our EQ section. They were actually able to improve both slip 1 and 2, enabling us to deploy our equipment efficiently, effectively, and then safely. So they were able to use their equipment to add to the site and then take from the site, increasing the depth and then increasing the launching distance that we had that made us successful in launching our equipment. So all in all, it always comes down to being a company effort. As an MRBC, you are relying on that person to your left and your right to maintain that accomplishment of your mission. So, but with an MRBC and with a site, there's always going to be challenges. So namely, the ones I'll hit on today are site restrictions, anchoring space, and then size of equipment versus operational environment. So going over site restrictions, the waters that we operated in Poland with Defender Europe were very shallow. The speeds were a lot faster than what we had practiced on here stateside at Fort Hood. And then lastly, the soil composition consists mainly of rocks. So when you couple the make of our equipment being aluminum, and then you throw in the rocks that were both jagged, rounded, very large, this creates puncture hazards. So if you puncture a piece, you got to get that thing out. But the thing to consider with that, again, is how is that going to affect your mission? So that's a real world scenario that we found ourselves in while operating at Wet Gap 2, as we had to remove pieces of our bridge after we had passed a column of tanks to maintain the effectiveness of that bridge. So moving on from that, the next thing we have is the anchoring space. So when it comes to a full enclosure, we typically like to anchor at the four corners, both near and far shore. So the issue that we had at Wet Gap 2 and Wet Gap 1 was the restriction of the site being very narrow. This didn't allow us to use our typical anchoring methods. So we were able to overcome this challenge by utilizing our bridge erection boats, which are, again, significantly more powerful than what the Swedish had, to actually anchor the bridge in place while we crossed roughly 200 vehicles, are all from the Polish, French, and then our own US forces. So lastly, when it comes to the operational environment, now Captain Vernon hit on this just a little bit, but you have to consider as the platoon leader, the size of your equipment and what considerations you need to have to make sure that you are not crowding your slip. So there's nothing worse than having a crowded slip. It creates hazards, it creates chaos, and it slows everything down. So by making sure that you only bring mission essential equipment to the actual slip is imperative to maintaining the success of your mission. Also important to note is having that EEP, your equipment park, your engineer equipment park, and your ERP, your regulating points, pre-established to help mitigate traffic at the site with your own equipment, and then ultimately to mitigate any concerns that you might come up with when you're ready to receive traffic and you're actually pushing these columns. In our case of anything from Humvee-sized vehicles all the way to our own M1 Abrams tanks that we're crossing at our site. Lastly, a couple of things I want to hit on is the interoperability again. So we had a very unique opportunity at Defender Europe to work with our international partners. So namely the Swedish. Again, they have the same equipment that we do when it comes to the bridging pieces themselves. So that led to our success with being able to connect our bridges and accomplish these full enclosures that we had at both Wet Gap 1 and Wet Gap 2. So working with them did create a few problems that we were able to overcome, namely communication. So there was a minor language barrier that existed between ourselves and some of our international partners. So to mitigate that problem, we were able to actually have liaisons that worked with or from our unit and then from their units, both integrated with each other, so that we can maintain constant communications with each other to make sure we stayed on time, make sure pieces were moving where they needed to be, and then ultimately just making sure that we were all moving in the same direction towards that full enclosure and accomplishing that mission that we had at both Wet Gap 1 and Wet Gap 2. So the last thing I'll leave you guys with today are a few of the items that the Swedish brought to the battlefield that we think would be extremely useful for our own MRVCs. So the first item that we have is the slip mat. So picture here at the top right of the slide, you can see the slip mat. You can see how our ramp actually sits on top of this rubberized mat. Now, what this does, if you go back to the site restrictions I mentioned earlier, the rocky soil composition that we were working with on both Wet Gap 1 and 2, this helped us to mitigate puncture hazards on the slip, as we're able to lower this slip mat onto the slip and improve the landing area for the ramp. So as you loaded your M1 Abrams, your Strykers, so on and so forth, and the ramp would actually push down to the water, it can rest on this mat instead of the rocks below. Essentially, you're prolonging the life of your equipment and maintaining healthy equipment for the next mission. So the next thing is the mounted roadway deployment system. Pictured here on the back of a CBT, this will help you improve any roadway that's leading up to the slip. So it's very important when you consider a situation like we had with Defender Europe, where we crossed over 200 vehicles at Wet Gap 2. The roadway will deteriorate very quickly, especially depending on the type of material you're working with. As we had a sandy-based material, that roadway became very deteriorated very quickly. Now this gives you a solid platform on which to improve that roadway. So be it sand, be it mud, you're able to extend a healthy roadway down to your slip mat and ultimately to your ramp that will help you receive that traffic that you're ultimately there across. So that's all I have for you guys today, and I'll pass it back over to Lieutenant Colonel Winkleman for our Q&A session. Thank you.
All right. Hey, great job by our briefers there. Hey, just a reminder, if you have questions, put them in our chat. I've been capturing all these here, and we're going to try to get to as many as we can. First one I'm going to ask is for each of our briefers. So as Napoleon says, amateurs discuss tactics, professionals discuss logistics. And obviously we're focused very heavily on the engineer side of this and the execution of it. But what were, for each of you at your level, what was your one or top two main sustainment or logistics challenge that you were focused on for this operation? And we'll start with Major Darhauer or the 5th Engineer Battalion team. If you want to talk at your level, what was your number one challenge? And we'll go to the company and platoon level. Over.
Yes, sir. Thanks for that question. I think at our level, it was really fuel. And if you actually think about this whole operation, like you have to understand, like if it's an armor brigade, like they're burning probably over 21,000 gallons of fuel a day. But we had challenges just getting fuel for the MRVC in this operation. So, that would be my comments there.
Yeah. And just real quick. So initially when we arrived in Poland, we had contracted fuel, and that fuel was not to the Army standard. And so we had several clogged fuel filters, and then we clogged up our fuel delivery systems. And so that created some additional headaches because we had dirty fuel in tanks that we had to have cleaned. And we just didn't anticipate that was going to be an issue. It's not one that we've normally dealt with in mature theaters.
I agree that fuel was a major issue, especially when we got that bad batch off the bat. It was difficult for us to get out the door. But one thing that really hindered our operations were the requirements that are set by Poland when we're moving in and out the country. So for example, we need March credits because our equipment is oversized. And so we had to get special approval with special routes, when and where exactly we could move throughout the country to get to our mission. And then secondly, it was really just from site to site where we had problems when we were going from where our equipment was parked to the actual gap crossing, because our equipment is oversized and we did have limitations. So we weren't able to build doctrinally. However, we were able to adapt and overcome and make sure that we had the equipment at the site when we needed it.
So at the platoon level, one of the biggest problems we had was just getting those maintenance parts out to our site. So an MRBC will go through a lot of equipment very quickly. It's just the nature of our job. Having those replacement parts on hand is crucial to maintaining keeping that equipment up. So just going through that logistical chain of trying to get all that maintenance to us, oils, lubricants, things like that. Big help if you got that on hand. Lastly, route recon and area recon. So as mentioned, as the platoon leader, you want to make sure your equipment's safe, secured, and properly concealed. Again, understanding that we were operating under the constraints of the Polish running it. And then as Captain Vernon mentioned, we had to secure land from both military and private citizens. We completely understand how these constraints were built into Defender Europe. However, just something to take note of is you should always be doing those route recons, always doing those area recons to understand where you're going and how you're going to help conceal and keep your equipment safe and secure.
Hey, Colonel Winkleman, I have one thing back over to 5th Engineers when we're talking about concealing. Hey, 5th, what did you guys do with your battalion TOC or TAC to get as close to the crossing site as you could?
Yeah, so this was actually kind of a little bit of a deception of our own, but we actually built out a 20-foot container that is actually a TOC inside, but it just looks like an old kind of decrepit container sitting on the ground. So it was kind of our deception plan to make our TOC not be realized by the enemy. Over.
Thanks, Scott. Okay, Jason, back to you.
All right. Hey, thank y'all for those answers on the logistics. Hey, next question. This is for 5th Engineer Battalions, more about kind of setting the conditions. We had several questions talking about like engineer reconnaissance. Can you describe a little more about what other like USACE type assets and things y'all used to help determine like site, the existing site conditions? What other like enablers did we use, divers and stuff? Can you elaborate a little bit on some of that, what y'all used, ERDIC and reach back? Over.
Yeah, so yeah, the first one for ERDIC there. So RS2 is actually able to use the reachback program and get a trafficability analysis of the roads leading up to there. Like it tells you, even soil compositions, maybe the amount of traffic it could actually hold. And then, we're considering an armor brigade. So these tanks are really heavy as well, and that can affect the actual road conditions. Let me see for the river itself, the stream flow prediction. So basically what they're doing is they're taking the weather forecast and they're analyzing in the future, what will the conditions of the stream be? So we have certain restrictions on like if the river goes above 10 feet per second, we basically can't operate. So ERDIC can really help shape like what the future of the river is going to look like. Like we know what it potentially is now, but what will it look like a week from now? And will the conditions be better to maybe launch the operation later? And
we did a lot of that analysis before we ever left, and ERDIC was really helpful in providing us that analysis. But in addition to that, once you get on the ground, you have to get eyes on the river, because while you can get general predictions of an area and they're pretty accurate, they can't see necessarily what the bottom conditions have changed over time, even if they have previous analysis. And so the divers were really helpful in getting them out there. If you have a semi-permissive environment or a permissive environment like we did, that was definitely helpful. But even, you can do those operations at night under the cover of darkness and sends people out there to really identify. So what are the actual conditions on the ground and verifying what you have digitally. We had a 10-man bridge reconnaissance section that we brought along with us from the 5th MRBC that got out there, looked at the site. We identified what equipment we were going to need from Carly's unit. And they brought some of their operators forward as well. So we could make sure that with these limited March credits that we had, that we could get the equipment to the site to improve the bank so that we could execute the operation.
Hey, guys,
All
what
right.
about, so the dive teams also, just so everybody's tracking, they have the capability to do their own survey. And that's something that we would recommend ahead of time in the future Defender Europes. Like Colonel Bailey, you were about 2 hours away from waving off on wet gap crossing number 1 because we could not set conditions. In the future, the divers can go in with their survey equipment and they can do the entire topography for us ahead of time. And then we can do more of the field expedient stuff on site if we adjust the site a little bit. So that's just a big thing. The divers were money. And if we could have gotten them integrated earlier, they would have even more so. You guys also brought the dog teams. What'd you use the dog teams for shaping?
Yeah, so we have the only mine dog detachment in the Army right now, and they were used they can detect mines on the near shore, which the enemy would probably in place there. And then your far shore and exit bank objectives, they help clear those. They were actually assaulted across with amphibious NATO vehicles. It's a pretty cool operation. Went over there, did a great job. Over.
So, and when you're doing conditions, like all of our staging areas and, your engineer equipment park, all those things, you're going to have military remnants of war, or mines in those locations because the enemy knows that's where you're going to want to set airfields. That's where you're going to want to set assembly areas because they're conducive. And so even our dogs coming out there, they were able to find some old munitions and things like that. None of them were determined to be dangerous. But just in the staging areas in Europe, you're going to run into unexploded ordnance, and bringing your dogs forward to clear the area reduces the risk to the soldiers in general.
All right. Hey, next question is for Captain Vernon. Captain Vernon, what was the challenge you had at the crossing site integrating like the enablers that you had, like MPs, logistics, medical folks? And then what were the challenges you had working with international partners?
So as far as our enablers, I would say that our biggest challenge was that there was not enough land allocated for them to properly set up TCPs and call forward areas. And so there was a lot of congestion coming up to Wet Gap 1, where we had to establish our ERP because we had new equipment that wasn't originally templated to come over the bridge, but they had to get their safety brief and make sure that they were able to enter the bridge correctly. However, it interfered with a TCP set up by the MPs. And then secondly, as far as the Swedish, I feel like it was very fluid. They have the exact same bridge system that we do, so they were able to interconnect with no issues. And then it was established before we got there that I was going to be the crossing site commander. And so we didn't have any conflicts with the Swedish. So they were able to integrate quickly with us. They only brought one platoon. And then their commander was extremely receptive and gave suggestions. And we worked together to come up with a plan to quickly and efficiently get across the river.
All right, this next question's for the PL. So some folks are asking here, how long does it take to put a raft together, and how long does it take to do a full enclosure? Obviously, that's METTC dependent on the width of the river, but just kind of like a ballpark. Like, can you give us an idea of that, please?
Yes, sir. So you hit it right on the head there. So METTC is always going to come into play. Also, the enemy has a say in everything we do. Typically, for full enclosure, you're looking at, for a good build on a non-restricted site, somewhere in the sub 24-minute area. Excuse me, for the raft. So for your 7-foot raft, your full enclosure again will take a little bit longer. The thing you have to consider again with a full enclosure is the necessary steps that make that full enclosure different than the raft itself. So there's different components that you have to disconnect and connect that will also increase the timing on the build. So again, the site really plays into it a lot. Having your EQ section out there to help you improve that site is essential to that. But an estimate that you can use for a full enclosure successful build is roughly twice that of the 7 float itself. So somewhere around the 45 minute time frame. Now, when you put that into nighttime, which is where we prefer to operate, again, it helps us stay concealed. It gives us better, helps with that deception plan as well. You're going to have to increase those numbers again by about 50%. It's just the size of the equipment. Again, that's why I hit on it during my brief, the size of equipment versus the operational area. And if you're working on a restricted site like we were for WECAP 1 and WECAP 2, that's always going to increase your time on site as well.
All right. This is for Captain Vernon and maybe even the 5th engineers as well. There were a question about environmental restrictions. Did y'all face any environmental restrictions operating on the river? I know here, like on stateside, we're restricted on where we can put in boats and things. Did they have anything over there in Europe that y'all faced and there was a constraint or restriction to your operation? Over.
Yes, sir. So mainly we were restricted to exactly which sites we were able to use, and then what times we were able to be in the water. So for our last mission, which was 2 simultaneous bridges, we essentially were told that you can only use these sites and you need to be in the water from this time to this time. Secondly, another constraint that we had was as Gary, you mentioned the rocky bed. So that threw a hazard to our equipment. And additionally, it was quite shallow at Wet Gap 2. And so we had to dredge to make sure that we were able to facilitate the Wet Gap crossing.
So this is Lieutenant Colonel Bailey. And so really we operated underneath the country's rules, and we had to pass up all digging operations in the river, all movement schedules, and all that through the Polish. And their turnaround times on answers to our questions were different than what we would expect. And so we oftentimes, we're waiting for permission to get things done. And it really came down to making sure that you got good intel up front so you can kind of shape expectations of what you're going to be asking to do, and so that they can start that approval process early.
All right. Hey, speaking kind of a follow-up question. So you'd mentioned, the rocky banks and potential damage to equipment. So how much redundant equipment was stored at the crossing site versus stuff back at the EEP to replace anything that was damaged? Can y'all elaborate on that a little bit, Captain Vernon?
So this was a unique build where our EEP was actually co-located with the actual slip site itself. And so we had at least one extra of everything on hand, and then we had people ready to push from our other site if necessary. But it was extremely constricted, so we weren't able to hold much, but we did have some redundancy.
But also on your first site, you had the consideration where you had to drive about 22 kilometers between critical locations. So talk about that a little bit, because that was a major complication in crossing site 1.
Yes, sir. So typically we template our EEP, which is our equipment engineer park, no more than 1 mile from the site, or behind one major terrain feature. Where they put our assembly area, we had to essentially drive, I think it was like 36 kilometers completely around the city because of load restrictions, height restrictions, to get to our slip site. We had to utilize the entire other platoon to essentially be drivers because it was such a long convoy. Additionally, because of the restrictions on the road, we were only able to push 5 pieces of equipment at once. So they were essentially doing turn and burns where they would come to the site, they would back up about the 200 meters to the site, drop their piece, stage for all the vehicles, and then go and grab some more pieces. It was also difficult because typically we don't always use a TC when coming back from the site to the EEP because it is so close. And we do need those personnel to be building the raft and be part of the shore team. And so that also had a constraint because we could not mitigate that risk. We had to have a TC in that seat, and it utilized a lot more people than we typically do. But it did cause quite a constraint because we were essentially running convoys all day just to get that equipment to the site, where it would be a quick turn from 1 mile away typically.
No,
All
thanks.
right.
That was because your first go around, it was all those troubles, and the second one was ideal because it was co-located. So I think you got to see both of those. Hey, Jason, the questions on shaping, I'd like to start that off and have Major Darhauer and Colonel Bailey. Several folks have asked about how the Corps and the division did some shaping operations. And so the 5th Corps came in on this pretty much the last minute and about the last 3 weeks before we departed, right? So what did 5th Corps between Major General Broadwater and then the 17th Mech in the fires warfighting function, the protection warfighting function, especially in that last river crossing where they actually brought everything to bear in front of the President of Poland? What are some of the things they did at the Corps, division, and even 17th Mech level, a brigade plus, to help set the conditions for you guys in each of the warfighting functions, please?
Yes, sir. So for that second wet gap crossing, when we did it in front of the Polish president there, the first thing they did was they brought in seed operations, right? They had fast movers coming in that suppress enemy air defense, if you don't know what that means. So fast movers came in, they had coordinated for them to take out, enemy air defense assets. They also brought in attack helicopters. They even simulated some air assault operations, which would have been coordinated by hire. Typically in this operation, they're going to coordinate, let me see here, air defense on our side as well. So they're going to bring air defense assets in, any kind of psychological operations, any other big element, they would be responsible for that.
And then in addition to that, there were several rehearsals that we did at 17th Mech Brigade where we identified timelines for movement. And that was both, they would normally do that, but obviously because we were moving through urban areas with our M1 Abrams and having to schedule HETs and the logistics side of the house to conduct those movements from their staging areas, which were about 45 minutes away, 50 minutes away. So they played a major role in developing the movement schedule. And I saw that question in here as well. They also manage fires, airspace, and then obviously on the far side, the maneuver commanders had to take into account, how much space they were going to have to take, and that really pushed probably 15 kilometers from the actual the exit bank objective, just to get the division minus, or I guess it would be like a brigade plus that we pushed across the river between the 4 bridge sites that day on that first on the second wet gap crossing.
Yeah, and just for the team, 5th Corps really got some reps about 3 weeks out on what they would do to integrate with, 17th Mech Brigade, who was in their quote unquote task organization. And we went through some of the things like planning for the air defense artillery and the protection. We talked about target areas of interest. We talked about how they would do the suppression of any air defense. We talked about some of the indirect fire capabilities. What would each of the nations bring to bear? Because we had Stingers and they had, what were those quad guns on the back of the trucks? Like literally it's an old school anti-aircraft system that they were fording across the river and shooting on the far side to provide an air defense artillery umbrella. So those are the type of things that we at the brigade, because we were doing DSURF, we did some of that coordination, but then the crossing area engineer, Colonel Bailey and Major Darhauer, had to do the final coordinations in theater. And, Captain Vernon and crew just worked within that umbrella with the conditions being set. So there was hopefully that answered some of those questions there on the side. If there are more, I can hit them later. Jason, back over to you.
All right, team. Hey, we got about 5 minutes left, so we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. This one's coming from CGSC. This is for Colonel Bailey. So as we're looking at the gap crossing class that they're teaching there, from your opinion, what is essential for all Army majors to know about gap crossing?
So I think that, basically for any operation, and especially with wet gap crossing, you have to have a couple things to be successful as any subordinate commander. And whether you're battalion or company, or you're going into TLPs for platoons, you have to have common operating graphics, you have to have an execution matrix, and you have to have clear commander's intent and planning guidance. And if you have those things, I think that if you have good commanders at any echelon, they can execute the mission. When it just differs in scope and scale when you're talking about divisions and brigades maneuvering, especially when you start working with foreign units. And it's real important that everybody, that you have good rehearsals, because that when you have Polish leaders there, you have Swedish leaders there, you have French leaders there. It helps that we have the NATO doctrine and we're able to communicate off of that. But really back briefs become very, very important, because a message sent is not a message received. And I would say that that's one of the things that 17th Mech Brigade did a really good job of, and it got much better at having comprehensive rehearsals where everybody talked through it, and then we began to make sure that the synchronization occurred. And I will tell you that when you go to those types of operations, event-based triggers are much more advanced than some of our partners are ready to jump into. And so just be ready for a very scheduled based and timeline focused event matrix, because that you're just not going to get to the point right away where you're able to get to triggers. We were during the second wet gap crossing in its infancy, but the majority of our operations were definitely time-based, and it made, all the way down to the platoon level, that timelines much more important than they possibly would be in other just U.S. military-centric operations.
Outstanding. And then last question I'll have for y'all as well, follow up kind of with that, traffic control of maneuver forces in and through the crossing area. Can you talk about some of the issues y'all faced with that and how y'all overcame those? Over.
So Captain Vernon can back me up on this one, but it's extremely critical in any gap crossing operation to have what we call laterals. So if something goes wrong with one site, those elements can maneuver over to another site, which is something that kind of happened. One bridge started slowing up, so Captain Vernon and her team were able to direct more of the traffic towards the other bridge. But you might actually, move them actually kilometers in another direction if a bridge gets destroyed. So those laterals are extremely valuable. MPs, there was also mobility forces, French mobility and Polish MPs that helped control the traffic leading up to the site through the cities, which was extremely important as well.
Like Major Darhauer said, at Wet Gap Crossing 2, at our second mission where we had simultaneous bridges open, they were extremely close together. So we were able to visually see which ones were congested and which ones weren't. So we essentially had my ops running traffic control at that critical point and directing them either left or right to see which way they could go. In a real situation, we obviously wouldn't want our bridges that close together, but I definitely agree that we need to have like a contingency, like, hey, we need to start pushing equipment towards that location to make sure that we don't have congestion and make that a bigger target for our adversaries. The way that they did it for Wet Gap 2 is that they had certain call forward areas that were pre-established by the maneuver elements, and they were manned by the TCP or by the MPs. And we had comms with those MPs to talk to them and say when the bridges were ready for traffic. And so we were able to keep a fluid motion the entire time.
All right, outstanding. Well, team, that brings us to.
Just before we go, Jason, one more
Yes, sir.
question. Just
Okay.
from either Sergeant Major Lake or our platoon sergeant over there, what is the number one factor that NCOs had to take into consideration as they were leading out there on the ground and make sure we were executing this operation safely? I'd like to hear one, Sergeant Jackson or Sergeant Major Lake, either one, if you guys want to jump in there.
Hey, Sergeant Major Miles, take it.
Yeah, so this is Sergeant Major Miles out of the 5th Engineer Battalion. I would say that the biggest thing to consider from the NCO side standpoint is when you do these sort of operations, you got to integrate multiple teams in a very quick fashion. So understanding and having the ability to intake multiple organizations and multiple new team members and creating an effective team and ensuring that your capacity to support those individuals is probably my biggest concern, the biggest challenge I faced.
No, thanks, Sergeant Major Miles. Sergeant Jackson, platoon sergeant, what was your thoughts? One of our heroes of the battlefield out there.
Mainly rest work cycle, sir. Making sure that soldiers are allocated proper rest time, but managing those teams, accountability was extremely important. Was able to keep accountability SI with all those moving parts, moving timeline, personnel across the battlefield, and PCC, PCI, whether it was uniform or with equipment, with operations, with MRBCs, you have build equipment not only for the actual RAF, but the boats itself, the trucks for shore crew, EP, ERP operations, and along with uniform, keeping those soldiers safe. So those are some of the main points as a platoon sergeant and sustainments, making sure that their morale and their health is up to par, dealing with sleeping areas and child planning, sir.
No, that's awesome, Sergeant Jackson. Thanks. Okay, Jason, back over here. I wanted to hear that NCO perspective real quick.
No, that was great. Hey, so that kind of wraps up our Q&A. Team, I know we ran out of time. We weren't able to answer every question. I did put my contact info in the chat. So if you have further questions for our panel members, please feel free to send me an email and I'll get that to our team there. Yeah, we want to definitely share what we've learned here. I know we're going to be writing some papers and stuff on this experience. So you should see some stuff in publication as well. So Colonel Marbini, I'll turn it over to you for any final remarks and we'll turn back over to General Watson. Over.
Sir, I have no final remarks. Thank you for this time. We really appreciate you to participate. Over.
Yeah, so first of all, incredible LPD by both Rugged, 5th Engineers, 74th. Just I really appreciate, and all of those folks that had such great questions. You know, in my notes, fuel, land management, importance of reconnaissance, March credits, which we never think about, the need to have resupply of parts, time constraints, specific windows. You can say all of these are because it was a peacetime exercise. You would be mistaken. These will befuddle you in combat operations. And so really good, great lessons learned. Just a final thought. I want to make this better. We're going to do this every month. We've got a Thursday. It'll be at the same time slot. The next one, we've got some recent company commander, a young major that are in USACE, and they're going to talk about their time in USACE doing project management and what they brought from their company command experience and why that has made them successful in USACE. And I think that's going to help broaden everybody's horizons about the things that you can do in USACE. So that's going to be a great event. That'll be on the 21st of July. I need your help in making this better. I need your help on topics. You could just go up to the engineer website for Army engineers and send us a note. If you've got any suggestions, we're absolutely all ears. Again, Anthony, Rugged Six, thanks very much for putting this together, and to your entire team. I'm extremely grateful. Thanks very much. Everybody have a great night.